Okay, let's see. I'm right outside of San Antonio, and I figure I'll do one when I'm up in this area. Do you see the judge? You should be able to see it. Judge Neal says he won't seek another term as Nueces County judge. I'll try and link it. I'll do a quick one. A few notes, and it's windy again. Maybe I can walk by this. It's pretty out here. I'll do a few quick notes. As I looked at all the media stories, and make no mistake about it, the shooting of the Republicans who were targeted at that congressional baseball practice, that was done by somebody that was Democratic and had liberal views and held to the views that the majority of the media hold to, which 90% of those in the media are liberals and Democrats. He also asked before the shooting, who's on the field, Republicans or Democrats? And when he heard they were Republicans, he began shooting. For those who don't, you should all be familiar with this. So he managed to shoot one Republican, Scalise. I don't know his condition right now, but he targeted Republicans, and he was a Democrat and liberal. But after that, all the reporting on the media was that there was no looking into whether or not some media coverage in the last year, some Democrat statements. If you went, and I read a lot of news sites, but there have been actually some radical left-wing sites that call for things like armed uprising and so forth. Now, if you had a conservative Republican, if you had some conservative Republican with all those views and was a supporter of Republicans, and that happened, the media there would be no media coverage that was saying, look how nice now the Democrats and Republicans are together. You had the Texas Congressman Joe Barton, actually from a lot in our area is discussed about Joe Barton. But he did a big press conference along with a Democrat that was also, they were on that baseball team, I guess, together. And they just talked together. The media also reported there was no questioning whether those on the left, the Democrats, on that side of the aisle, whether some of their rhetoric, there was none of that. And then the media began going back to Sarah Palin. When Sarah Palin was running, she said the word target, not meaning like an actual target, and the media ran for months that the Republicans and conservatives were advocating the shooting, the violence, and the killing. And then you had the tragic shooting of Gabby Gifford. The media did not say anything along the lines of what they're saying now, which was this has nothing to do with statements on the left that were radical, and nothing to what they're covering it now, which was a tragedy of a person shooting and targeting Republicans. The way they covered any other type of thing, they don't do it the same way. Okay? And then you had Nancy Pelosi already make the statement, how dare anybody say that any radical statements from Democrats in the last few years, and some have been made, and Nancy Pelosi said, how dare anybody say that this shooting of Republicans by a Democrat, this targeting of Republicans by a Democrat with a sniper rifle, Pelosi says, how dare anybody think it has to do with any radical views that have been espoused by any Democrats, and some have been espoused. So that's what you see as bias. And then I knew it wouldn't take long before the media began actually saying this Democrat who targeted and shot at Republicans, it's Trump's fault. And then they began showing, this is what you have as media bias. Nobody advocates for the shooting of anybody. Now, another thing is I got this video on, and it's a beautiful spot out here, not too far from San Antonio right now. As soon as you saw violence, many on both sides of the aisle immediately came together, which I applaud that. They said, look, we got to sit down. We got to think. But do you know, as a society, as the leader of the Western world, the United States, if you went back and looked, we are going to send another 4,000 troops back into Afghanistan, which is America's longest war. And if you were to interview, see, the Taliban is fighting us, and we are fighting them. 11 years now. And if you sat and said, wait a minute, a lot of lives have been taken. In Syria, it looks like Russia might have actually killed the leader of ISIS in the city of Raqqa. Okay? That's in the media today. But now the media is all Russia is colluding with Trump. But if you sat down and said, let's talk to you, Taliban, which, look, Obama was trying to do that at the end, said, a lot of lives have been lost here, a lot of civilian lives. There were more deaths in Syria in the last 3 months. There's national organizations that looks at all the civilian deaths. In the last 3 months in Syria, there were more civilian casualties by U.S. bombs and raids than by ISIS, than by Russia, and then by Syria. Isn't that amazing? In the U.S.-backed raids that have been going on in Syria. Not that we targeted them, but that's a statistic that we should all think about. And if you sat with Afghanistan leaders, so why are we here 11 years? Said, well, the initial attack and invasion of Afghanistan under the first president, Hamid Karzai, who is now a tremendous vocal critic of the United States. But the initial one was the Taliban, who have no concerns about the United States or world affairs. The Taliban simply has issues in Afghanistan. And indeed, they do want to have like it as a Sharia government over there. And we started the war because the Taliban gave assistance to bin Laden and the original group Al-Qaeda, who did indeed target our towers, which is the worst terrorist attack we had in our country, World Trade Center. So we said, because you gave them, Afghanistan gave them areas to operate under. It's the regions between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Therefore, we're going to make a statement to send to George Bush. Okay, that's why. And then if we sat today and said, wait a minute, if we took the same view that our country took in the last few days, when there was actual violence by a Democrat and liberal against a Republican, and then everybody on both sides for a few days said, wait a minute, let's sit down, let's think. Can you imagine if we did that in these other affairs? And what would the Taliban say to us? We could ask them, who are you actually? How did you rise up as this rebel group within Afghanistan? And their answer would be, you, the United States, who are now engaged in your longest American war, you established us and you raised us up, which is true. The Taliban is a United States and American invention to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. That's who the Taliban is. And then they say, oh, okay, because there's a lot of violence taking place, a lot of innocent lives lost, so we want to think this through as Americans, just like we had to start thinking it through when there was violence by a liberal Democrat shooting Republicans. Don't ever forget that. Don't let the media manipulate you. If you had a right-wing Republican targeting Democrats, Pelosi and everybody else would not be sitting down and having meetings. They would be outraged and saying, now look what Trump has done. His supporters have targeted us. That's what the media would be doing. There would no media coverage of, no one's, and instead the media is now blaming Republicans, starting to go down that road. And then we'd say to the Taliban, okay, so now we're thinking about it because a lot of lives are being lost. So the Taliban could say to us, so you started this war here because we gave room to a group that was called Al-Qaeda. You say yes. And they did indeed attack the towers. Say, but you know, ISIS now is in our country, which they're in Afghanistan. And ISIS is doing some attacks against the Taliban, as well as against civilians within Afghanistan to destabilize it. ISIS is also now in Libya and other places. And the Taliban could respond and say, but the premier terrorist group today is really not Al-Qaeda anymore. They're now ISIS. And they could ask us, and how did ISIS arise? Because this is also a big problem now. And we could answer, well, we invaded a country by the name of Iraq, and a lot of violence, a lot of death, a lot of civilian loss of life. And did we sit down and talk? Did we discuss when George W. Bush had Colin Powell say, they have weapons of mass, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, Saddam's lying about it, and if you actually sat down, Saddam says, I don't have them. He didn't have them. But we didn't want to talk. Let's go ahead and show. And then we had an invasion in Iraq, and a lot of lives were lost. See, when there's violence in our home turf, we have a tendency to say, wait a minute, let's think this thing through. But when there's violence carried out in other nations, we really don't want to think it through. We really don't. We have political, even the Democrats, because they all voted. There was like one Democrat, I think, that didn't vote for the Iraq invasion, who had a clear conscience because we didn't have justification. And then if you sat down and said, oh, you mean you invaded Iraq on false intelligence, false evidence, many lives are lost, and even the lives of children were lost. Why didn't you sit down and think about that after there was the loss of life? Just like you're thinking in this country now, just that a Republican was shot by a Democrat. Why don't you even, well, yeah, we never think that way. Unless it hits our shores, then we think that way. And then we could tell the Taliban. And there was an Iraqi army soldier, because we fired all them soldiers under Donald Rumsfeld and George W. Bush in Iraq. We said, you all out of work, you all lost your jobs. And some radical groups that were part of that former Iraqi army started heading north from Iraq, going up towards Syria area. And they formed their own rebel group called ISIS. And so then we could tell the Taliban, actually it was our mistaken invasion of Iraq, which till this very day, we're not concerned about the loss of life. We're not all upset. But one U.S. person targeted by a Democrat with a sniper rifle, then we had a conversation. Then we said, look, violence is the last resort, which it is. But when we engage in violence around the world, oh, wait, no, there's no sit down, Mr. Saddam. Maybe you're telling the truth. No, wait, he was telling the truth. And we found him in a hole hiding in Iraq. And then he was hung in the streets. See, we as a society, we've got a lot of questions. Things that we don't think through. So I wanted to do this one. I showed you Judge Lloyd Neal. He's out. We continue to make commentary about the local political issues because I've documented enough in the last 6 months, last year, that there's real problems within Corpus Christi and Oasis County. Not just me saying it, the ICE raids, 10% of they did the ICE raids that covered those, 10% of them were within Corpus Christi. Media looked at that. KRAS said, why is that so? It's not just a gang problem or a drug problem. There were less in Houston. Houston, much greater population and more crime, but yet there were maybe 50 in Houston that were arrested, and across the whole country, 10%. Why? I showed you, that's corruption. Oasis County ranked second most corrupt. That's corruption. Do the people I mentioned in leadership the last few weeks, are they connected with some of that corruption? I really don't know. But that whole thing needs to be cleared out, meaning those that have been there for a long time, they need to be just voted out. Do I think that some of the Sandra Watts or some in leadership who are white have an inherent racial bias against Mexicans? Yes, I sure do. I sure do honestly believe that. I really do. And I think it would be good if the local population recognized that as well. And like I said, the biggest bone to pick was not with that woman. I just showed you how she just dealt with my little jury duty then. Sort of like an arrogance. Instead of an apology, you're going to arrest somebody because you released them from jury. So what is that? That's a tremendous problem within Corpus Christi and Nueces County. So if this is the last one for today, at least I did one from this area. The psalm that I did teach, Psalms 40, that'll kind of be the little scripture for this rollout. When God delivered David, when God delivered his people out of the pit, there was a time period where they were silent. Their voice was silenced. Then God established his people on a firm foundation. And then he put a song of praise in their mouth. But the people that heard it feared. I think we mistake what that means. The people that heard it feared. It's not just the praises that we do in church on Sunday or when the churches are involved in things they're involved in. It's when we magnify God. Because then it said, then that great scripture, sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not. God's not really concerned about church-type things, you see. And all those religious things that they saw that as the primary mode of what they were called to do in the Old Testament prophecy says you're not carrying out justice. You're not a voice in society. Then it's written, in the volume of the book it is written of me, I have come to do thy will, O God. You have opened my ears. So Jesus is the Logos, the Word of God. He was the incarnated, the Word, who also, through his act of crucifixion and resurrection, carried out justice within society, enabled forgiveness to go forth. But first there had to be acknowledgement of sin. There had to be repentance. I mentioned the Bloodsworth case. That this last video I'll do a little more. He was a Marine who did 4 years in the Marine, had no record. But there was a little girl that was murdered in, I guess it was Maryland, I'll link it. She was a 9-year-old girl. She was sexually molested and murdered. But he also just had a marriage that was falling apart. And then he was leaving the area, which made it look suspicious. Why did he leave? And then when they interviewed him, there was a lot of wrongdoing in this case. But when they interviewed him and the cops brought him in, on the table they had like a certain item, a rock and some panties, which were parts of the crime scene. And they showed them to Mr. Bloodworth, the Marine. And then when Mr. Bloodworth left, some of the family members asked him, what happened? What did they ask you about? And he told some of the family members, look, they asked me about the death of that innocent girl. They showed me a rock and some panties. Okay, then the cops went and interviewed the family relatives. And they asked the family relatives, this is just part of it. They asked the family relatives, did you have any conversations with Mr. Bloodworth about the crime of the young girl that was murdered? Yes. What did Mr. Bloodworth tell you? Well, he said that you showed him a rock and you showed him panties, which was evidence that only the criminal would have known. Do you know that law enforcement, in his case, used that as evidence against him, saying he had information about the crime that only the criminal knew? You say, but John, that would be distorting it. And then Mr. Bloodsworth also said, remember, when they say anything you say and can and will be used against you in a court of law, they meant anything you say. So even though the cops themselves showed Mr. Bloodsworth the evidence in the rape and murder of that young girl, yet the statement he made to his relatives after, meaning what did the cops say, what did they show you, they used that, took it out of context, and used that as evidence against him. That's just one of many. No, none of that is justice in society. He was later exonerated because they finally found the DNA of the real rapist and murderer. All of that has nothing, when you engage in that, when you, whether it's Watts or whoever, that has nothing to do with being a righteous servant of the community. That has nothing to do when you engage in false testimony and all stuff like that. You're just as much a criminal when you engage in that as any of my friends who are trying to overcome addiction, overcome the street life. I view no difference. The only thing is, those who engage in that criminal activity, they get paid by you and me, the taxpayers, and they continue. But these are elected officials. So in Nueces County, because of the ranking of the second most corrupt in the U.S., the only thing we could say is in Nueces County, you should re-elect everybody. Just get all the old people out and bring some new people in. Okay? We'll end it on that one.